Right, well, let's try that again. Um, Facebook Live was playing up, so here I am in Singapore, and it's baking hot. It's about 32 degrees midday, sitting on the Esplanade. It's very pleasant down here. Very beautiful city. Love Singapore as a city. Very livable. I want to talk about a question that I'm often asked, and it's asked of myself as an investor and an entrepreneur and a real estate investor, is that, you know, what do you need to become successful? Is it resources, i.e. money, or is it resourcefulness? And yeah, it requires money to be successful, but you don't actually need to have your own money. You can use somebody else's money. And this is what I want to talk about when it comes to resourcefulness, is that you can leverage OPM, so other people's money. So I think it's appropriate that we talk about that in the context of Singapore. So here's a city that was founded in 1959 by Lee Kuan Yew. And if you go to the Asian Civilizations Museum, which is just over there, you can see what it looked like before. And what it was before was the remnants of the British Empire. Singapore didn't really exist. You had the warehouses from the traders and the merchants. You had the Indian laborers, Chinese laborers, and that was really it. And a few of the local Malay laborers as well. And there are absolutely no natural resources here apart from the fact that there's a port. Which raises an interesting question, because if you look at the history of where Singapore has come from, look at it today, just look at the shoreline here and just flip back round to Marina Bay Sands, which you're probably familiar with from other people's social media posts. It's testament to the fact that you don't need resources. It's all about resourcefulness. And this is an interesting comparison, because if you look also at another country which was formed in 1959, Cuba, by Fidel Castro. Now, Cuba and Singapore were both started at the same time, and Cuba's rich in resources. You know, Cuba has resources, whereas Singapore doesn't. And on top of that, when they were formed in 1959, Cuba was actually richer in terms of GDP than Singapore. So this raises an interesting question, is that what happened in those 60 years that Cuba became, well, you know, a shadow of what it possibly could have become compared to Singapore? And it comes down to this idea of resources versus resourcefulness. Because if it was all down to resources, Cuba would have been far richer than Singapore is today. But Singapore is significantly richer in terms of GDP, if not one of the richest nations in the world, certainly in the top 10. Better long lifespan, so it's one of the highest life expectancies in the world compared to Cuba. A much lower infant mortality rate, etc., etc. So what happened? It wasn't down to resources. So the story I want to tell here is that it's about how you use what you have, and it comes down to resourcefulness. And this is so important to anybody in this group as an investor, i.e. being that you don't have to have anything to bring to the table apart from your own resourcefulness. And let's say, for example, you wanted to get into real estate property. You might not have any startup capital, you might not have any existing portfolio, but what you have is a pair of hands and you have a brain, and you can use that, and you can certainly go to other investors and prove your worth. So there are plenty of investors out there who have capital but don't have the time, or maybe the wherewithal, or the guts to go out and do the kind of things that you could do for them. So, for example, when I got started in property, one of the things I did was I started going to auctions. And the reason I went to auctions was because I could learn, you could meet people, and it's a pretty raw environment where you can meet investors fast. So I started going to auctions. I didn't have any startup capital of my own, and I went to auctions and I found out that there were a lot of investors in auctions who had money, but they didn't have the time to go and check out the auction property. So one of the things I did was identified who these investors were, made friends with them, built a relationship with them, and said, hey, look, do you want me to go and check out that property? I'll go and check it out for you. And I did it for free. I would go and check it out, and I would learn, and that gave me a foothold into property. And I think it's the same as Singapore. It's like, you got to have that attitude, is that, okay, I don't have anything, but what can I do? Well, how can I get ahead? What can I do now? Rather than, how can I use what I have in terms of resources? So a lack of resources is often a stopping point, I should say, for investors. And there's always a way. And often that way is found by building relationships with other people and finding out what the information gap is. So, it's so true in the startup world where I operate. Singapore is one of the hottest cities in the world for startups right now. Is you have a situation where people have an idea or they have a very germane business, but they don't have the cash to grow that business. So those two startup founders will go to an angel investor, and the angel investor will put anywhere between $25,000 and $150,000 into that business to get it going. And it just goes to show that they don't have the capital resources to start a business, but somebody else does. And that angel investor doesn't have the idea or the time or the appetite to start his own business, but he has the capital. So there's that perfect marriage where you can bring those two people together. So, one has resources and one has resourcefulness. So I think that's the lesson I want to share from Singapore, is that, look at the results, is that it's nothing to do with what you have or the resources. It's all about how you can bring your creativity and innovation to the table and be of value to somebody else. Singapore built itself of manufacturing and then services, and now increasingly so in high-tech startup business. It doesn't have any of that in terms of resources to start out with. So don't let that stop you. Don't let a lack of money stop you getting into property, because people will say, oh, well, that costs money to get into property. You need 15%, 25% down payment to pay for an investment. Well, you might not be buying a property now, but you can certainly get started. You can certainly build relationships with property investors. You can certainly educate yourself. You can go to the events. You can network. You can be of use. And eventually, if you keep opening lots of doors, opportunity is going to walk through one of them. So, what do you think about my live session here from Singapore on resources versus resourcefulness? Does it make you think? Have you ever thought a lack of resources stopped you getting ahead in property investment or in business for that matter? Would like to know. Put your ideas and comments in the usual place, and look forward to interacting with you there. Signing off from Singapore. I'll see you later.